Robert Mugabe clings to power even as world leaders refuse to recognise the outcome of Friday's election runoff. With no challenger after the opposition leader announced his withdrawal, will the elections become a referendum on Mugabe's policies or a hijacking of the political shift seen in the first round results? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. Zimbabwe was once considered the breadbasket of Africa. These days, it could be more accurately described as Africa's basket case. It has a long-standing president fixated on the country's colonial past, an opposition leader too fearful to take place in a runoff election, and a downtrodden population spending millions of almost worthless dollars on life's essentials. That's when they're actually available. Just what has gone wrong? Why can democracy not flourish? And with this Friday's presidential runoff virtually meaningless, is it the place of the international community to intervene? These are all things we'll discuss in today's show, but first this report from Beth Ann Howe.
The hopes of a nation rest uneasily on the shoulders of this man. Morgan Tsvangirai had been sheltering at the Dutch embassy in Zimbabwe, claiming he could not continue in the country's elections for fear of being assassinated. He left the embassy's safety to call on the international community for help.
Due to the urgency of the situation, I am asking the African heads of state to discuss this crisis at their meeting this weekend in Egypt. Let me be clear. This cannot be a part-time mediation effort. Neither can it be a continuation of talks about talks that have largely been fruitless for several years. The time for action is now. The people and the country can wait no longer. We need to show leadership in Africa.
President Robert Mugabe earlier dismissed Tsvangirai's claims of threats to the opposition leader's life.
Seeking refuge. What for? Nobody wants to harm him. Hapana. These are voters. They will do you no harm. Political harm, perhaps, yes, when they vote against you. That's true.
Without an opposition candidate from the Movement for Democratic Change, President Mugabe will go unchallenged. The presidential runoff could become the equivalent of a referendum on the current presidency. Some argue that this means Mugabe has succeeded through intimidating the greatest threat to his regime, and that neighbouring African countries should do more. By far the most powerful of those neighbours is South Africa. There had been expectations that President Thabo Mbeki would use his influence to help the democratic process. However, he has yet to take any concrete action.
It is still necessary that the political leadership of Zimbabwe should get together and find a solution to the challenges that face Zimbabwe. So I would hope that that leadership would still be open to a process which would result in them coming to some agreement about what happens to their country. And that most certainly is what we would try to encourage.
Morgan Tsvangirai has sought assistance from African leaders and asked that they support him and the MDC's win in the March elections. But Zimbabwe has a regime synonymous with not backing down. And for the moment, Robert Mugabe looks to continue his control over the country indefinitely. Beth Ann Howe for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests at this point. In London, George Shire, he is a Zimbabwean political analyst. In Johannesburg, Roy Bennett, a treasurer and a senior member of Zimbabwe's Movement for Democratic Change, the MDC. And also in Johannesburg, rounding out our team, David Monnier, an independent political analyst. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Roy Bennett, first I'm going to come to you in Johannesburg. Morgan Tsvangirai on Wednesday said he wants to see a SADC-AU initiative that would oversee a transitional process based on the original results of March 29. That sounds to me to be very ambitious and perhaps even a bit fanciful.
No, I don't think so at all. I think it is the ongoing process that was initiated by SADC on the 11th of March 2007 when the leadership of the MDC was brutally beaten by the Mugabe regime, and SADC intervened in the crisis and appointed President Mbeki as the mediator to move forward that free and fair elections would be held in an environment that is conducive to such, with an uncontestable outcome.
But presumably it's dependent on Robert Mugabe coming to the party, if you like. Taking two to tango, as Morgan Tsvangirai told us earlier today, and I doubt that's going to happen.
Well, I think it's very clear and very obvious. This is not about elections. This is about a transfer of power. It's very clear that Robert Mugabe and his ZANU-PF party have lost the popular support of the people of Zimbabwe, as they clearly demonstrated under all odds on the 29th of March of this year.
George Shire in London, if I can come back to the actual vote itself, this runoff which is due for Friday, why do you think is ZANU-PF pressing on with this vote? I mean, I think most people would look at it and think it can't be democratic, it can't be the choice of the people when there's actually only one man running.
The legal position, the constitutional position is that nobody can call off the runoff. Nobody can, including Morgan Tsvangirai, cannot constitutionally pull out of the process at this stage. So whether it was ZANU-PF or the MDC, nobody in law could do so. If anybody wanted to do that, they should have done that 28 days after the announcement of the election, and neither the MDC or the ZANU-PF indicated that process. That's the first.
But constitutionally, sorry, I'm going to jump in just a minute.
Okay. I just want to clarify something. Even if one wanted to make that situation, you would have to make a constitutional amendment to allow for that process to take place. And again, neither the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission, which is the authority responsible for that constitutionally, following from an amendment, constitutional amendment, which the MDC and ZANU-PF participated together in November last year. The legal position on the ground does not allow anybody, nor has anyone got the authority to call it off.
Okay,
even
what about
if you want it that way?
Forget, and this might sound odd, but forget legal for a moment. What about common sense, which says how can you have a runoff between two people if one of them says, I'm not taking part?
Well, they're entitled to do. Morgan Tsvangirai is entitled to do so, just as Robert Mugabe. What if Robert Mugabe had said, I'm pulling out of this election? What would then that mean? It would still be exactly the same way we are now, right? I think we should not conduct this discussion in a way in which, simply because we're the preferred outcome. There is the legal constitutional position first. There is the political arena in which it is taking place. There are moral questions people might want to ask, but they do not in themselves stand in the way and addressing what the constitutional position should be. And the constitutional position should be nobody at this stage can call off the runoff election. Even the United Nations can't do that.
Roy Bennett, just a quick thought from you before I move on to David Monye in response to what George Shire has been saying.
With all due respect, he's talking through the top of his head. We're already in breach of the Constitution. The runoff was supposed to take place 21 days after the end of the election. 21 days after the end of the election, ZANU-PF still hadn't released the results. The whole process is a farce and totally unconstitutional, already breached illegally.
Okay, I'm going to move on and get some thoughts from David Monye in Johannesburg, who's been waiting there. From your standpoint there, what do you think of Morgan Tsvangirai's position at the moment? Did he make, in your opinion, the right decision pulling out of this race?
I think he made a brilliant move in terms of pulling out. But the strategy that he's using in terms of rushing and hiding in Dutch embassy instead of an African embassy in Harare, it's a completely kind of, it is misplaced. And I think from a legal perspective, I think the first speaker made it quite clear. In the short term, it appears to me that President Robert Mugabe has an upper hand in terms of dealing with issues, protecting Zimbabwean sovereignty. But at the end of the day, we are living in a global community that is constantly changing. We are all entering into uncharted waters, and it brings challenges to all Zimbabweans, the region and the international community. What is needed is people to be much more sober in dealing with these issues, realizing that what is needed is negotiation to deal with legal issues in Zimbabwe, change the very same constitution of Zimbabwe, which is part of the problem, and dealing with outstanding issues involving Britain and powerful countries that appear to be saying the right things, but using wrong strategies and bulldozing African negotiators on the ground.
But you talk about negotiation.
We're in a dilemma, all of us.
You talk about negotiation. What about the simple idea of going to the voting booths on the day when you're supposed to and casting your ballot? By pulling out of the race, Morgan Tsvangirai has effectively denied his supporters that right.
I think most of us were opposed to the idea of resolving Zimbabwe's crisis through the ballot box. From the word go, I think I said on this channel that Zimbabwe's crisis will never be resolved through the ballot box at this stage, even though we fully support democracy and the electoral process, which should be the answer to most problems of governance. However, the situation in Zimbabwe requires a negotiated settlement. I think that is central. How you go about doing it, it's something that everyone seems to be mixed up and confused.
Indeed. Gentlemen, we're going to take a break here on Inside Story. When we come back, we'll discuss the international role in Zimbabwe's crisis. Back in a moment.